Hey, this is Kat.
And Jess.
You know, Mother She Wrote is free to listen to, but it's not free to make.
So please, consider supporting our work on Patreon or supporting Cast.
You'll get early, ad-free episodes of this show and a whole lot more.
Head to mothershewrote.earth/support to chip in and join our community of world-saving wonderkind.
Oh, and heads up, this episode contains brief discussion of apocalyptic prophecies and cults. Love you!
You cast your onyx hook into the ocean of consciousness and slide beyond, into another dimension. A dimension of sound. A dimension of dreams. A dimension of love. You're crossing over into a realm of insightful interviews, expanding the themes and discussions of the Mother series. You've just been transported through a dimensional slip.
Welcome to Dimensional Slip, intermittent interludes in Mother She Wrote's journey, where we speak with guests from a multitude of backgrounds and further explore the themes, media, and fandom that make up the tapestry of the EarthBound experience. I'm the doodle in your margins. I'm the half-remembered idea in the outline of your heart. I'm your intrepid investigator of Mother Media, Kat Blackard. And with me, as always, is...
your Tokyo-trotting traveler, Jessica Mudd.
In this episode, we're joined by EarthBound YouTuber MonkeyNess and fangamers Charlie Verdin for an in-depth exploration of the Secrets of Mother 2 exhibit that ran from August 1st to September 8th at Shibuya Parco in Tokyo.
It was absolutely incredible. We talked about seeing Totori's clay figures in person at the exhibit a little bit in our prior Dimensional Slip episode. The rest of the exhibit was filled with early production artwork, unused ideas and enemies, and a ton of writing. Hundreds of pages of notes, all in Japanese.
Fortunately, we toured the exhibit with a translator. So, in this episode, we're going through the exhibit section by section, sharing discoveries and observations that shed light onto the creative process behind one of the greatest video games ever made. But before we go any further, I want to give caution, dear listener. This is a very different Dimensional Slip episode.
Yep. We normally make Dimensional Slips to be part of the Mother She Wrote journey, meant to be listened to as they come out, in sequence with the storytelling episodes.
For example, we've got a Dimensional Slip on the way that's all about Stephen King and Peter Straub's book, The Talisman, and its connection to Mother. But that won't be released until after we've concluded the story of EarthBound Beginnings, so that we can freely discuss everything.
But this Dimensional Slip episode that you are listening to right now, it doesn't fit neatly in sequence with the rest of the show. This Dimensional Slip is for the Mother fans who've played all the games and want to be up on the latest discoveries.
So caution, this episode contains spoilers for the entire Mother trilogy. Mother 1, Mother 2, Mother 3. If you're avoiding spoilers, do not go any further. Come back to this episode later.
As you may know, I haven't played Mother 3 yet. But don't worry, nothing's been spoiled for me. There's a section of this episode that even I haven't listened to.
But if you've played all the games, welcome, friend. You're ready to dive in.
One last little bit of housekeeping. We normally number Dimensional Slips, but you may have noticed that this one isn't numbered. This is Dimensional Slip Episode Alpha. Anytime in the future that there's episodes that don't really fit in the sequence of the rest of the show, we'll give them Greek letters like the psi abilities.
And so, when you see a future episode labeled Dimensional Slip Beta, you'll know at a glance. It's a weird one.
Now, you may have heard that there's a book of the Secrets of Mother 2 exhibit coming out November 27th, which promises 320 pages of scripts, concept art, interviews, and more.
We don't know if it's everything from the exhibit, or if it has even more material from Mother 2's production.
Time will tell. We'll link to where you can pre-order it on this episode's page.
It won't be long before fans will be able to leisurely explore this wealth of information. But we wanted to take some time to document the experience of the exhibit specifically, because it was a really big deal.
It was serendipitous that we happened to be in Tokyo at the same time as the exhibit. We'd set a date for our interview with Itoi, and then the exhibit was announced. 2 birds, 1 stone.
Just like the fireman predicted.
By the time we'd made it to Tokyo in late August, rumors of what was in the exhibit had already started circulating, and that's where MonkeyNess comes in. His YouTube videos are a source for all kinds of historical and cultural mother info, so when his video EarthBound's development and cut content debuted, it was the English language source for the corroborated information and insights from the exhibit.
As a result, we went to the exhibit with some knowledge of what to look for and where to dig deeper. Also, We weren't the only people there who had the benefit of attending the exhibit with a bilingual colleague. My old pal, Charlie Verdin, attended as well and had his own insights.
So, we're pooling all these resources together to see if we can make a kind of virtual tour of the exhibit for you to join us on.
And we now have visual references that we can share. Photography was forbidden in the exhibit outside of some designated areas, but on the exhibit's final day, Hobonichi hosted a live tour on their YouTube channel. Tai-Dai Nagata from Hobonichi Mother Project and Mr. Yamashita, who I believe was the exhibit manager, lead viewers through the exhibit with a surprise appearance by Shigesato Itoi at the end.
As with everything with the exhibit, this video is in Japanese. But if you combine that video with this podcast discussion, we hope you'll be able to get a sense of what information was presented, what secrets we learned, and what it was like to be there. We'll link to Hobonichi's walkthrough video on this episode's page as well.
So without further preamble, please welcome to the show, MonkeyNess and Charlie.
Hi everyone, my name is MonkeyNess, and I make video essays and historical documentation videos on the Mother series.
Hi, I'm Charlie Verdin. I am an employee at Fangamer, and I just happened to go see the event.
Well, that's true, Charlie. But being an employee at Fangamer and also a graybeard in Starman terms,
That too, yes.
we go way back.
That's true, that's true.
And in fact, you were one of the first folks that I met of the Starman people in real life. And we both sort of stepped into our adult lives in tandem together, doing weird nerd stuff.
Yeah, what a wild ride it's been since, for sure.
Yeah. One that happened to probably not coincidentally result in us both being in Japan at the exact same time.
Yeah.
And seeing the exact same EarthBound exhibit. Or as you as you called it when it was announced, hot new limited time nerd mecha just dropped.
Yeah. And not an insignificant number of people ended up also viewing it for that same reason. Just like, all right, well, I guess we've got to go to Japan at short notice, so let's go.
Yep.
Yeah, it was wild. We ran into so many people there.
Yeah, we definitely spoke English to other human beings a lot more than the last time we were in Japan as a result. So, folks, there's a gauntlet you have to pass through when you step foot on the USS Mother, she wrote, and that
The
is
dimensional ship, if you will.
the dimensional ship. Yep. What's your folks' favorite pizzas?
My favorite kind of pizza is generally pretty boring, just standard pepperoni. However, depending on the quality of the meatball, like if you make a really good meatball, I will take that as a replacement for pepperoni. But if you're a pretty middling pizza place, then yeah, the pepperoni is probably going to be fine.
Good story structure to that answer. You had the but and therefore. I like pineapple and mushrooms.
Hell yeah.
I like them individually, but I do like them together, which I know isn't the most normal answer.
That's a perfect answer in my book. That is a perfect answer. That's exactly the kind of surrealist nonsense that I expected when I started asking people about their favorite pizza toppings. So thank you for
Happy to
delivering.
deliver.
Yeah. When this exhibit got announced, what were your folks' first thoughts about what you anticipated to see or what might be there, or even just that it was happening at all?
I was not expecting it to be as much like nitty-gritty early development stuff as it ended up being. Because in the promo video they first put out, they showed Itoi shuffling through some papers and some early like character design stuff for like Ness and Paula. And I was like, okay, so it's going to be mostly like concept art and stuff. So I was expecting, since, the game notoriously went through like development hell and everything, I imagined that it was going to be a lot of stuff post that when it took a more definitive shape. So like 1993 era stuff post Iwata's involvement, but we got much more than that.
Yeah, we sure did.
Yeah, I was also expecting more of a visual element than there ended up being, like concept art and the figures, and they definitely did have that. But the sheer amount of it that was old papers on the wall that you could only hope that you could read was surprising to me.
It was truly remarkable. For people who really love these games, the idea of the paperwork is very exciting. And I think someone, involved in the production of this must have said, like, no, people do actually really, really want to see this. Would be really curious to see it.
I want to say, too, about the people visiting the exhibit. It was all demographics of people. It was old, young, men, women. Everybody was there. It's
just like the tagline.
Wild. Yeah.
A surprising number of young people, really, who definitely seemed like they were born well after the games came out.
Yeah, and I wanted to know the story of everybody that was in there, how they came to know this series, how they came to enjoy it, and how they enjoy it.
Yeah. And also, one other cool factor about the exhibit is that once you bought your ticket, if you held on to your ticket, you could come back as many times as there was space for you.
Wow.
Yeah, Itoi said that in his introductory message, that he realized that it would take people a long time to sort of parse through all the information that was there in the exhibit. So they specifically set it up so that you could come back and look at it and see it again, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, we
That's
certainly
very
took
cool.
advantage of it. It was necessary.
The event was sort of laid out linearly, so you could kind of see from the very beginning the earliest documents for development, and it kind of progressed as it got to like the final changes that they were making near the exit. And you could see in different places flowcharts and diagrams of how they expected the game to go, the different areas that you would travel to, and sort of how you would get from point A to point B. And it was really cool just seeing how that evolved over the course of development.
Yeah.
The thing that opens the exhibit immediately is, like, as you're stepping into it, a number of colored folders in a case with the Ness paperclay figure. And that's an image a lot of folks have seen because that's one of the few parts of the exhibit that you're actually allowed to take photos of. Most of it, Jess and I were walking through, and turned out we weren't even allowed to use our phones for live transcription to attempt to read anything that was on the wall.
Yeah, they were very kind but very firm, coming up and telling us to stop pointing our phones at the documents.
After that opening display, the first thing that you see is a wall of text written by Itoi, which I have done a kind of like abbreviated and paraphrased translation of. I knew there were cardboard boxes full of materials for Mother 2 in the back of the warehouse that I've kept since the 90s. Exploring the contents wasn't something that could be done lightly, so I kept them there carefully. 2024 marks the 30th anniversary of Mother 2, and we felt that this was the perfect time to open that vault. In viewing this exhibit, you'll understand just how valuable and irreplaceable the materials contained within that box were. Handwritten letters, faded notes, pixel art. Mother fans could talk all night long poring over and deciphering them. But before you see them, there's just one thing I'd like to make clear. It should go without saying that Mother 2 is everything that's in the game. Everything that wasn't included is something that myself and the other creators ultimately decided isn't part of the game. As fans, we feel an indescribable romanticism about what was originally conceived, what was deleted, etc. It's a strong feeling that even I get. This exhibition is exactly that. However, there's a risk that the completed work will be perceived as incomplete if any of the ideas that were not included are taken as truth. Making that assumption detracts from the completed work. So to be clear, Mother 2 is the game that was released August 27th, 1994. The Secrets of Mother 2 is an exhibit of ideas and materials that were necessary for the creation of Mother 2. Perceiving it this way, I feel, is something that can really get us fans excited. The reason that I finally opened that long unopened box was because of the 30th anniversary, but that's not all. Putting together this exhibit was strongly influenced by the support of so many Mother fans around the world for the Hobonichi Mother Project, which began 4 years ago. Thanks to you, we knew that there were definitely people out there who wanted to see something like this. In that sense, it was thanks to the support of all the Mother fans that we opened this box that had been sleeping for over 30 years. Thank you very much. Sorry for the long introduction. I hope you enjoy every bit of this dreamlike exhibition.
That was paraphrasing, huh?
Yep.
Wow.
I mean, a bit.
Nice work, Kat.
Yeah, he apologized for the length.
It is really cool that they did just find a box of stuff one day and thought, yeah, people will come see this for sure. People will come and pay money to come in and look at all this stuff on the wall. And you know what? They were right. I think they were more right than they expected to be.
Yes, it was crowded every single day that we went. Even on a Thursday in the middle of the workday, it was slammed.
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of overseas Mother fans in particular don't really understand about its cultural legacy in Japan is how immensely popular it still remains. You know, it's seen as kind of a more of a cult thing pretty much everywhere else, but it's still very much a big success there, especially like the Hobonichi Techno planners and everything, extremely huge there. And as someone who has read like every Itoi interview I could get my hands on, it's like so interesting to hear him take such a more definitive stance on like a lore adjacent subject of saying like what's in the game is what Mother 2 is. What's here is just a collection of ideas. It is not Mother 2, because he's been notoriously so sort of vague in the past about things being up to people's interpretation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Talking about endings, character threads, stuff like that.
Yeah. I think the reason that he's being so definitive is because he's seen how the looseness of determining canonicity of something has kind of circled back around. Like, he does really like hearing people's theories on stuff. I think he doesn't want people to lose that. So he doesn't want people to read these like variations on what the plot is or could be and think, oh, well, this is it. This is the answer finally. Because it's not. And in fact, in many cases, I think that he seems to be playing things for vibes way more than anyone would suspect.
For sure.
After Itoi's introduction, the next section is a really incredible thing to see for any creative process. And I think that Itoi, as a creator himself, you know, he knows what would get him excited about the art that he loves. So here is a bunch of pages of the earliest sketches of ideas for what Mother 2 could be. And it is loose and wild and actually kind of outlines a game that doesn't exist. It's so far removed from what Mother 2 ended up being that is very much like a sketch for another game.
Yeah, very little of that spaghetti stuck to the wall.
Yeah.
And I can definitely see like why he had to give that warning immediately before this, because a lot of the stuff you can see possibly having gotten into the final game and maybe be a little disappointed that some of it wasn't explored as much in the final game as you might have hoped. But look, we had to cut all this stuff for one reason or another. Don't take this stuff as canon, but also try not to be too disappointed that it didn't end up there.
One of my favorite pages in the whole exhibit is early on. It's got a loose drawing of some like sort of continental shapes of the Earth with some dots on it. And then there's several orbs to the right of that. They're labeled. There's the moon and Mars, with 2 key events on Mars, and then Saturn. Dots 1 to 5 take place in the United States. Dots 6 to 10 are other locations on Earth, like other continents, places that would end up being like Winters or Foggy Land and Dalam or Como. And then dots 14 through 20 are other planets, with dot 11 being the moon. The numbers go up to 24. 21 is likely Magicant. It's described as a rogue planet or rogue area, something like that. And then once the issue of Area 21 is solved, then you go to Area 22 and 23, both of which are the ancient continent of Mu, which is on the map somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. And there's Mu in the past and Mu in the present. And then 24 is the final area somewhere else, somewhere not on the map, theoretically where Geeg would be. When I saw that, especially with Mars and Saturn being there, I thought of Itoi's referencing the talisman so heavily in the creation of Mother, and seeing now that a book that had been mentioned a number of times as an inspiration for EarthBound, Mother 2, that doesn't have an abundance of obvious reference points in the game itself, was actually a very big reference point early on. It looks like that Kurt Vonnegut's The Sirens of Titan was a huge influence for the plot of the original sketch of Mother 2.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how the threads of Vonnegut's work work their way all the way from development. We see the seeds in this very early stage, and that is one of the things that actually made it all the way through to the very end product, which is interesting to see, and how the Mr. Saturn are an offshoot of the Tralfamadorians.
Hey folks, Kat here with an annotation. Jess and I will be popping in occasionally to provide a little background. Kurt Vonnegut is, of course, a highly influential 20th century American novelist. He's best known for his 1969 novel Slaughterhouse-Five, which features the Tralfamadorians, an all-seeing alien species who, in contrast to their immense power and intelligence, look totally ridiculous. They're described as plungers with a hand atop them and a single eye in the palm of the hand. They're goofy and silly, but also wise beyond human understanding. Just like a certain Mother 2 species, the Mr. Saturns, or Bakasan, Mr. Stupids, as they were called in many of these early development documents. Tralfamadorians don't just appear in Slaughterhouse-Five. The name is applied to many alien worlds and beings across Vonnegut's books, but they first appear in Sirens of Titan, where a messenger of theirs has crash-landed on Titan, a moon of the planet Saturn.
It's interesting to see this step in the series. There's like a very logical evolution of the storytelling for it, because the first game is very much focused on elements of space and sci-fi and stuff. And then they're introducing elements in this next installment to the series that's branching out into time travel as well. And it's interesting to take the step from space to time, because obviously those go hand in hand.
This is a great time for us to explain the Sirens of Titan a little bit here. I am going to do a whole episode on this at some point. But essentially, the book, it's linear, but it's a book that bends a perception of time quite a bit. And it takes place on the Earth and Mars and the moon of Saturn, Titan, with those various things being kind of like staging grounds. We go on to find out in this exhibit that going from Earth to the moon was going to kind of be a staging ground for voyaging out to other places and other times. And having Mars and Saturn in the mix as well suggests to me how much he was thinking about Sirens of Titan, like without a doubt. And the kind of vaguely nonlinear component of the story he was playing with here feels really inspired by that book.
You said, too, that the last place that you went in the original roadmap was Mu.
How is Mu spelled?
MU.
MU, so like the type of meditation training Pooh ends up ultimately doing in Dalam.
Yeah, and this early version is so steeped in paranormal stuff, even more than the final game. I don't know how it is that Mu found its way to Pooh's meditation training, but on the problems that needed to be solved page, there was a section that said, in relation to Mother 1, Geeg after Mother 1 becomes gigantic and hides in the lost continent of Mu, eventually escaping to the past. One thing that these early drafts of the game remind me of a lot, in addition to Kurt Vonnegut, is also Illusion of Gaia, which came out within the scope of, like, around the time that this game would have also come out from Enix, which is about a kid fending off an evil comet that's approaching Earth and going to different, for the most part, real locations of power all around the Earth.
Recognizable locations on an unrecognizable Earth, I would say.
Yeah, very much so, which is a reoccurring part of that trilogy of games. It's very interesting, but there's kind of like, there's a cultural overlap between whatever it was that the creators of those games were saying about, like, humanity and ancient civilizations and, like, kind of like maybe what was happening in the cultural zeitgeist, both in Japan and then also in the 90s at large. The 90s was, of course, the decade of the X-Files, where, you know, conspiracy theories and New Age spiritualities and ancient histories were all, like, colliding into one crazy soup. And the lost continent of Mu is a location in Illusion of Gaia.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
It was as I remember, was it an underwater location?
It had been underwater, and then it rose from the depths like Lost Carcosa.
Okay. Well,
alrighty, and that aligns with it being somewhere in the ocean in this original roadmap, huh?
Yep.
Mu is also the 12th letter of the Greek alphabet. And since, you know, we have the different psi powers, beta, gamma.
Oh, I would never have thought that.
Maybe.
And coincidentally, Mu is derived from the Egyptian hieroglyph symbol for water.
Oh.
And there's also mention of Atlantis in these same early notes. For example, eventually the notes devolve into just a series of, like, lists of, like, ideas, and they're sometimes just lines like ice world, collect ashes. And you're like, I don't know what this means at all. But one of the things that it said was orichalcum, and then metal floating in air in parentheses, and then Atlantis. So orichalcum is the lost metal of Atlantis. Plato wrote about it and said that it was second only to gold in value, and that the temple to Poseidon and Clito in Atlantis flashed with the red light of orichalcum. And it was supposed to have been mined, but historians now believe that it was likely an early brass alloy, copper and zinc. And in 2015, a sunken ship was found with ingots that are suspected to have been orichalcum. Now, what Itoi meant by metal floating in the air, I don't know, because I couldn't find any myths or stories relating to that.
Orichalcum is a metal that shows up sometimes in RPGs as well.
Yeah, it's always a very valuable, the idea
mysterious metal.
Yeah, some kind of supernatural metal, and I think having it float in the air is just a way of showing that, probably.
As for what was on Mars or Saturn, I didn't see anything that was, like, definitively, oh yeah, that's probably what this is.
They probably scrapped the planning before they got to that phase because they decided that that was ultimately not the direction they were going to go.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, friends, turns out before we move on, I've got a lot more to say about Mu and the cultural headspace that Mother 2 was conceived in the midst of. Intrepid researcher Biozilla has done some digging and discovered that in Japan, Mu is a major feature in the occult landscape. It's a strange and twisty story, so bear with me. You see, in 1926, British writer James Churchward published a book called The Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Man, which cobbled together legends of Atlantis, theories of a lost continent called Lemuria, historical mistranslations, and the writings of a hack antiquarian to create his own half-baked theory that all major ancient civilizations stem from this theoretical continent of Mu, home to a technologically advanced race and the Garden of Eden, now lost to time, but signs of their once great empire remain. The book, and its 4 follow-ups, made their mark in paranormal circles around the globe. Churchward was even name-dropped in a Lovecraft story. But his books saw new life in 1968 when they were translated and published in Japan. They became bestsellers and hallmarks of the catalog of publisher Tairiku Shobo, whose name translates to Continent Bookshop, itself a reference to Mu. So clearly it was known in Japan before then, but from that point on, and well into the 70s, books about Mu and ancient astronaut theories were commonplace. Notably, there's also a well-known Japanese magazine called Mu, named after the lost continent, of course. It debuted in 1979, and it still exists today, covering the gamut of paranormal and occult discourse. In fact, this summer, on July 31st, 2024, marking this year's Mother anniversaries, there was an article published in Mu entitled The Truth About Mother 2, the 90s occult masterpiece 30 years later. Was Geeg the Great King of Terror? Hobonichi even plugged the article on their socials. This article, written by Minako Sugiura, is of course in Japanese. But BioZilla translated it, and there are some significant cultural insights within. Sugiura cites Geeg as a symbolic representation of the paranormal paranoia of the 1990s and says, when Mother 2 was released, Japan's mainstream occult boom that started in the 70s had reached its zenith. Playing Mother 2 again in the present day, I'm shocked by the various occult motifs in it. They're like a culmination of that boom. BioZilla corresponded with Sugiura and zeroed in on an interesting image in some of the unused enemy sprites seen in the exhibit. A moai stone head, like the ones famously found on Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. Moai are famously attributed to ancient alien theories, so it's not out of place in Mother 2. But why do they show up so much in Japanese media in general? Well, it turns out what we're looking at is a probable enemy on the in-game continent of Mu. Churchward, that guy that published the first book about Mu, argued that the former continent stretched across the Pacific, not the Atlantic, and that the Polynesian islands are the remnants of the continent after a seismic event that completely obliterated it in almost a single night. He claimed that moai are relics from Mu's civilization. Sugiura shared that moai iconography in Japan rose up alongside the paranormal boom of the 70s, and in 1979, Japanese science fiction novelist Sakio Komatsu published the book The Mystery of Easter Island, further focusing in on their possible paranormal origins. BioZilla posits the theory that perhaps what was the lost continent of Mu in early drafts became the lost underworld instead, and that this early moai sprite, with certain stylistic similarities, may have been retooled into the enemy we now know as the Ego Orb. There's more insights to share from Sugiura's article, but we'll get into that in a little bit. We need more context from the exhibit first. Let's jump back to some more items from Itoi's list entitled Problems to be Solved. The protagonist isn't related to Nenten, but learns about the events of Mother 1 through records, and the influence of George and Maria, a hint for creating Magic Hand. And these things have been poured over a little bit out in the ether. It's interesting seeing all this, especially because there's MonkeyNess, you've mentioned this connection between these early sketches of story ideas and the Mother 2 manga.
Yeah, which is really interesting because it seems that over the last month and a half of Peel finding things out, we found quite a few connections between the manga and some of these early concepts. Now, you could chop something up like Ness finding out about Nenten through records to possibly being a coincidence. In the manga, he finds out about him through looking through old newspapers at the library. But there are some things that are much more specific that, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your view, Benimaru Itoi, who wrote and illustrated it, was given so much creative license with it that we see these little seeds of things that we have been finding out about in early documentation. But it's kind of hard to pinpoint and find what exactly is actually remnants of that and what is that creative license.
Yeah, and the same thing is present in the Mother novelization with the inclusion of like the IC chip, a deleted item from the game that its presence there is clearly based on having notes from an early version of the game. But then there's just everything else about the novel that's completely different from the game and isn't based on anything other than the imagination of the author.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what were the materials they were given. Obviously, they were given like notes or something, but like what visuals they were given to take cues from in describing and illustrating locations.
Yeah, I imagine that the experience, especially of Japanese fans of the game, was pretty different because they had much more of a connection to the original. They had the potential to have that connection. And so we're probably looking for ways for the two games to be connected more than we were in the States. And it's interesting to see how much of this early stuff did have more of a connection between Mothers 1 and 2 that ended up not making it to the final thing, which is kind of a shame because, like, skipping ahead a little bit in the early sprites that ended up getting cut, there's also a sprite of Eve, the robot. And it's like, what would that robot be doing in Mother 2? I don't know, but it made it pretty far to the spriting stage at the very least. I can understand that the ideas just got steadily more simplified over the course of it, but I would have been interested in a version of Mother 2 that did have more of an explicit connection to Mother 1 in some way, instead of what we got, which to some degree felt like more of a reboot of Mother 1 instead of a continuation of the story.
Yeah, and you see those connections, those more direct connections to Mother 1 also, and how they vaguely discuss Magicant and Georgia Maria. It's funny to see how definitive it seemed that they were dedicated and set on connecting it to the first game more when far, far into development, when the game's taken on a much more familiar shape to what it ended up becoming. There's like cut dialogue where Mother 1 is just mentioned as a joke game that Orange Kid lent Apple Kid.
Yeah. It is interesting seeing how there aren't many tethers back to the first game. And for all of us who love the first game, it feels like it would be really nice to have more of a direct connection like that. One of the components that we learn about Ness going into space is that there was an idea for a nostalgia planet where you could go and you could learn more about the prior game, and the music would change to like music from the prior game. It would definitively develop that connection, which is, of course, something that we see resurrected in Mother 3.
Which, interestingly, Mother 3 does not seem to have any connection to Mother 1, comparatively.
The only tie is the music that plays prior to when you get on the ship in like the walk down memory lane, as I call it.
Yeah. And I mean, especially for that reason, it seems like a shame that Mother 1 never got those tethers back. And because now the only possible space for that connection is wild fan speculation, which I think Itoi in some regards seems to appreciate. But at the same time, I guess it must not matter. If it mattered, they probably would have added something else to connect it in the end.
Yeah, based on what actually came about, it just feels more and more like Mother 1 is the bastard child that nobody wants to think about anymore and has just been set aside, which is a shame because of how cool it is.
And yet this game remains, Mother 2, Geek strikes back. Like, strikes back. You can't ignore that.
It makes you wonder what the ideation for this connection early on was envisioned to be, because there's these notes saying Ness isn't related to Nintendo, yet we see that Ness's character design seemingly was pretty early on decided on, like, pretty definitively, like, or at least not like significant changes were made to it over time. It seems like mostly the changes that came later were like color related. So it's interesting that that would be such a defined thing in Itoi's mind, yet he still decided to pursue Ness being Nintendo in a mirror.
Yeah, it is odd. Maybe there will be more about these like missed connections in the book when it comes out. Though the book being 320 pages and the amount of pages in the exhibit, depending on if every page got a page, well, I don't know how many pages would be left. So from these early notes, we get a vague sense of what the final conflict with Geek is in the final game, and this different premise for how the character would be venturing out and recovering other characters to fight alongside. There's a page that says Chapter 1, Psychic Hunt, and the kind of hunt that it means is like a hunt to kill. It outlines this kind of like opening cinematic. It says, it's 2003, night. A middle-aged man in a rubber raincoat rides an old bicycle through the pouring rain. In 2003, the bicycle is considered an antique. He's heading to Ness's house, located on top of a small hill. He has a telegram and he's knocking on the door. Ness watches TV in his room with his dog. His mom calls out, "Ness, it looks like someone's here. Please come out." Ness goes downstairs and opens the door. The man says, "Ness, right? It's now 11:23 p.m. on October 20th, 2003. This is a telegram I'm supposed to give you," which has big Back to the Future 2 vibes. The man on his bike disappear. Only the tire tracks from his bike remain. So this sets up for what's sort of suggested in the notes, which is the game takes place in 2003, but you have to go back to 1991 to recruit party members who have died. And going back in time to get somebody to help save the world is very Terminator, which is interesting because Terminator 2 had not come out yet. I think there's some important changes that happened because of pop culture shifting around the lengthy development of this game. So Mother was released in Japan on July 27th, 1989. And Terminator 2 came out July 1991. Mother 2 wasn't then released until August 27th, 1994. In this version of the game, it's kind of like you are Buzz going back in time to get help from people who, if it's a psychic hunt, Geeg has hunted and killed these psychic children, and you're trying to get to them before he does.
Yeah, it's interesting to see those very, very early design things because it kind of gives you a glimpse into like the subconscious of the game industry in Japan at the time, because it is a view of a game that is like a completely different game from Mother 2, but it's something that a lot of people point out has a lot of similarities to games like Chrono Trigger, which were in development at the same time. But there's certain ideas that stayed pretty true throughout the whole thing, regardless of how the rest of the shape of the game turned out. Like, what immediately jumped out to me is someone coming to Ness's house in the middle of the night and him having to answer the door at his mother's request. That is 100% in the final product. But it also leans much heavier into the concept that gets kind of relegated to the backstage in the final game of that Gygas is attacking from the past. And that is how he's able to get as much done as quickly as he can. And that's why ultimately EarthBound adds up to what it does in its final act.
Yeah, to some degree, like, it loses clarity on why that is over the course of development. Like, I'm not entirely sure why we have to go 10 years into the past to defeat Gygas. Why is he there and not here? Like, what is going on? But then a lot of what Gygas's or Geeg's motivations are lost over the course of the development, it seemed. Like, he had a plan early in development, and then by the end, he is just sort of a mindless, like, embodiment of evil instead of being a creature with a goal in mind.
He becomes much more omniscient for sure. But another element that kind of remained is that early on, he was supposed to become a giant, right? And he does kind of, in a sense, become a giant in the final game with how he's kind of just this oppressive force over the entire world at all times.
Maybe that's the form of his attack, because you can't comprehend it.
I mean, I certainly can't comprehend what the plan is most of the time.
Well, yeah, and it makes you wonder if like certain elements that are in the final game story were initially meant to be a lot clearer, like stuff like the Apple of Enlightenment and stuff that's talked about very vaguely and very sporadically that you never really get definitive answers on.
And that, from what I could tell, wasn't mentioned really anywhere in the exhibit until the game that we all know started to take shape.
Do you think it's possible it ended up being a MacGuffin that they kind of created to kind of expedite some of the storytelling?
Absolutely. That is my professional storyteller opinion. Yes, 100%.
Kind of feels like Geeg is like the main character of these stories. It's Geeg's story through the decades, or
which is why it's so frustrating how little we know about Geeg, or mysterious. Frustrating when you get down to the level of analysis that all of us are involved in, and a lot better when you're just a person playing it, being like, "Oh, that was creepy. Okay, I guess it's scary that I didn't know." However, there is a section in these early notes that explicitly says Geeg's plan.
Just gonna lay it out like that.
But these notes, which are bullet pointed, are still very loose and strange. The entire universe is going to be destroyed anyhow, including Earth. Nothing can stop this. Geeg's final goal is for all intelligent life to experience a beautiful demise. Previous records of this: extinction of the dinosaurs, the end of the Mu continent. Get rid of the potential threats while they're still seedlings, which, likely means the kids while they're still children.
That's interesting because the concept of like, if the game was supposed to sort of end initially in the continent of Mu, and like Gygas is talking about these previous examples of worldwide extinction of things, presumably at this place where one of these things took place, it's actually kind of similar to like the ending of the 1,000-Year Door, in that you enter this ancient castle in order to confront this ancient evil. It's an interesting archetypal storytelling element to a lot of these grand mythological adventures.
Yeah, and it's been a long time since I played Final Fantasy IV, but I feel like the end story for that game is kind of that same vein as well. Like you travel to the moon and there's like an ancient civilization there that you have to like go back in time to fight the final boss or something like that.
Hey, it's Kat here again with another annotation continuing our journey into the history of paranormal paranoia in Japan and ancient civilizations and the end times in the video games of the 90s. You'll remember that I mentioned that article in the magazine Moo, The Truth About Mother 2, the 90s occult masterpiece 30 years later. Was Geeg the Great King of Terror? So, what's that Great King of Terror business? Well, it wasn't just Moo that entered the cultural zeitgeist in 70s Japan. It was also the prophecies of Nostradamus. In 1973, Tsutomu, or Ben Goto, wrote The Prophecies of Nostradamus, a heavily embellished translation of Nostradamus' prophecies mixed with blatant fiction that preyed upon Japanese insecurities amidst a period of unrest. This paperback book was a massive overnight success. It introduced Japan to Nostradamus and was, unfortunately, perceived as more or less fact. Similar things have happened with Nostradamus' writings the world over, but apparently in Japan it was particularly intense. Paranoia about these prophecies reached a fever pitch in the 90s thanks to one Nostradamus quote in particular. In the 7th month of the year 1999, the great king of terror will come to Earth and destroy mankind. In Sugiura's article in Moo about Mother, she says, as many of you may remember from back then, this prophecy of human extinction was so commonplace that ordinary adults, whether they fully believed it or not, would say in everyday conversation, I hear that humanity will go extinct in 1999. In other words, Nostradamus' prophecy was alive and well in Japan in 1994. Sugiura suggests that at that time, it would have been easy for the average Japanese person to interpret Geeg as the great king of terror, leading to humanity's end. These apocalyptic ideas tie into Illusion of Gaia as well. It's part of a trilogy of games, alongside Soul Blazer and Terra Nigma, sometimes called the Soul Blazer Trilogy. All of these games are about the death and resurrection of civilization and humanity's relationship with the Earth. The connection between Mother 2 and Gaia, by way of Moo, is funny to me because years ago, I zeroed in on another parallel between these two game series. At Camp Fangamer 2016, I hosted a panel called Mother 3 and the Soul Blazer Trilogy, exploring parallels between these games' apocalyptic stories of rebirth. Now it seems to me that the parallels run deeper and can be more clearly traced to the message of a particular cultural and generational moment. A message that, all occult trappings aside, is still intensely relevant. If you'd like to learn more about the Soul Blazer Trilogy, I can point you to my old podcast, Nerdy Show. You can find it on any podcast player. Just look for an episode we put out in July 2016 called Terra Nigma and the Quintet Legacy. It's a spoilery overview of the games, which I think you'll find very relevant to this discussion. Also, that Camp Fangamer panel I mentioned was recorded, and you can hear it over on our Patreon or supporting cast. We'll link to all these things on this episode's page. MonkeyNess mentioned Chrono Trigger as well. These games, and many other pieces of Japanese media at the time, all feel the mark of this shared cultural influence. I'd gotten a sense of it over the years, but I wasn't able to put my finger on what exactly it was, this vibe, until now. Thanks to BioZilla and Minako Sugiura. Now, back to the exhibit, and more discussion about Geeg.
It's interesting that post Mother 1, it seems Itoi became set on what was more important to him about Gygas was who he was rather than what it is he actually aims to do. Because it seems like the plan has always kind of had this sort of generic element to it of like kind of world demise, world domination with like these flourishes on it. And it always has seemed to be more important to Itoi, the mental struggle Gygas faced throughout his life and how it ended up ruining him.
Yeah, the two things that always makes me think of is kind of like, one, there's when it comes to the obscurity of Geek's plan, there's the nature of the cosmic horror of like H.P. Lovecraft. The less you know about something, the more inexplicable it is, and therefore the more terrifying it is, which is, valid and true. But then also, it always comes back to something that I heard Guillermo del Toro say once, which is like, if you can't view a monster in repose, then it's not threatening because it doesn't seem real. You have to know what the monster looks like when he's asleep. And so there's both this extreme obscurity and like no elaboration on the plans, and at the same time, you also are constantly bearing witness to Geeg's weakness as a being.
Geeg in both games very much is given like the akusametra element of storytelling, where it's everyone talking about him until the very end when you see him, to maximize that impact, right? Yeah. To not let you have to dwell much after the game actually is over to think about what he literally is.
Which is very much contrasted with the other villain of the game, who eventually kind of supplants Geeg entirely, which is Pokey, who is with you the entire time. You know exactly what he is. He's the annoying kid next door, but he becomes more and more of a threat until eventually he's the one who is your real threat that lingers after the game is over. Whereas Geeg seems like he is just gone and almost an afterthought.
Well, yeah, it's kind of playing into that thematic motif that you can't really get rid of the evil in the world, right?
Yeah, there are some later meeting notes. These are from October 27th, 1992. Itoi is generally kind of like asking questions, considering the state of the current iteration of the plot. What was Geeg's motivation? Was it just to fight the prophecy? What's the point of Porky? Why does Geeg come to Earth? That's like the big question, and there's like beneath it like two possible answers. To get rid of Ness, and the same reason as Mother 1, to take over the world, to fulfill his wish from 1. Why does he have to get rid of Ness? Because the Apple of Enlightenment said that Ness would destroy Geeg. How was Ness able to defeat Geeg? Because Ness was blood related to Ninten? Then that says this is not the case. He's not related to Ninten. Was fate just playing a prank? Ness was the chosen one. And then does Porky survive? In the next game, does he become a medieval king? Is the one who kills Geeg the descendants of Ness? So to prevent Geeg's demise from happening, is it that Geeg has to go to the past then? And then he says, and this is, again, these are notes from 1992, that's maybe a bit too much like Terminator 2.
Yeah, I was about to say, this is getting very Terminator.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's so interesting, October 1992, because the first footage of the game was shown only a month and a half later, in late November, early December, something like that.
Yeah.
That's crazy that there was still these kinds of heavy story issues that had not been resolved yet, especially for a character as major as Porky.
Yeah, and following that, it says, Porky's position. Is he Geeg's trump card, hence the battle with Ness? Or did he just end up getting in Geeg's way? And there's no conclusion. He doesn't know. Not at this point, anyway.
It's interesting to think of Itoi putting a character into a project like this that he doesn't know the end purpose of, because everything comes across as so purposeful throughout these games, and dropping in a character that plays such a major role, he's still asking, what's the point?
That's interesting. I mean, I feel like there's definitely purpose to a lot of things, but also Itoi just likes to do things and then sort of figure it out later. I think Porky was initially supposed to be the childhood bully, or the frenemy that eventually, your tensions kind of escalate. It's something that's relatable for children. And I'm just guessing here, but I kind of feel like maybe Itoi thought, it'd be kind of fun if these two rivals, kind of like in the Pokemon games, are going on their own adventures and sort of coming into contact every once in a while, but constantly in conflict with each other, just kind of become the ultimate fight. They're still there, going at it. How do you explain that? I think it may be as simple as just he thought that it would be cool and relatable for kids playing the game, and then figuring out why it's like that later.
Yeah, and there are themes that carry over. Porky, and we'll get into this in future seasons, but Porky is very adjacent to a character from The Talisman, Morgan Sloat. And then also, especially combined with what was being considered for the plot of Mother 2, ties into a character from The Sirens of Titan. And this idea of somebody who is very selfish and then gets kind of placed into this outside of time position of power where he can influence things, that for Itoi snowballs into, I think, some bigger ideas that I think he's sort of this feels good. And then when you get to pages like those ones from October in 92, then he's asking okay, well, in the scope of what we have in the game so far, what is visible? We've chased down these feelings. Do they make sense enough? Do we need to address them? And that's me attempting to interpret this work, what the exhibit shows. It's not that he doesn't know, but he's chasing the feelings more than he's working on a meticulous steel trap of a plot.
Yeah, and development-wise, it would probably make sense that a lot of these things ended up after Iwata stepped in and they kind of more defined the engine of the game and actual technical aspects like that, why a lot of these story issues he's having just get resolved or possibly just unresolved, but they had to decide on something because now the game is solidified in its technical state.
Yeah. Rewinding back to the beginning a little bit, there was a second round of handwritten notes that had a bunch of very sparse ideas, just kind of scattershot notes like, the flying man returns. So that makes sense. There was what looked like a sketch of a gathering of planetoids and their orbits. And that's a little fuzzy on what that is in these notes, but we'll come back to that later. Because there's this idea of star maps that for this version of the game seemed rather important. We also see a planet that's colonized, a ghost space station, and if your photo is taken, your soul is taken. Well, That doesn't happen.
And yet I did, whenever I used to play the game, try to avoid the photo man like the plague. So I sensed it. I sensed it deep down.
What was he doing?
The Tanzura brothers are originally written as Tanzura Blues Band, which then the note says you'll later see them in Foggyland, which is interesting because, one, the Runaway Five never go to Foggyland or Winters, and also that it is actually written as Foggyland here because Foggyland and Como don't appear anywhere in the actual finished game in terms of those names.
Yeah, those specific names, yeah.
Ness would first learn about Jeff on the news via a TV that's playing in the Tucson bus station. And this is also where we learn about the list of towns and Fivrant, which would have been a parallel to Cape Canaveral, and that's how you would get then to the moon. Interestingly, in terms of towns and stuff, I believe that a page that showed up in the promotional materials for the exhibit, but actually wasn't at the exhibit, was the page that talks about Twin Pigs Village.
Which is a very, very interesting section of the manga as well. And, obviously Twin Peaks was a huge inspiration for a lot of Japanese media at the time because it was just so huge there. But it's interesting, particularly in Ito's envisioning of it, how much it resembles a Twin Peaks kind of premise. There's a detective looking for somebody and all that, and there's a lot of weird paranormal activity going on.
Yeah, so on this paper that was in the promotional materials for the exhibit and was translated by Pineapple Carl, we see mention of Twin Pigs Village, and then that, as MonkeyNess just said, appears in Benimaru Ito's manga in a huge way. It takes up most of the manga, really, as a place that's outside of time, and that there are two parallel Twin Pigs villages, and you can kind of get lost going between the two of them. There's a part where the kids go check into a hotel, and then Ness and Porky go walking around and then come back and they've never checked into the hotel and they've never seen them before because they're in another version of the same town. And then this detective who's trying to find out more about the disappearance of Mr. Saturn, and the detective is named Georgia Head, and he's always drinking what appears to be canned coffee, and that would be probably because of the serialized Twin Peaks Georgia coffee ads that were playing in Japan. He's not just a reference to Dale Cooper because he's a trench coat wearing detective, he's also drinking the canned coffee that Kyle MacLachlan, as Dale Cooper, was selling on television at the time. Mr. Saturn looks very different, and Mr. Saturn is, throughout most of this exhibit, referred to as Baka-san, Mr. Stupid. We never see this design that was used in the manga anywhere. It could be purely an invention of the manga artist, but there's this different kind of idea for what Mr. Saturn could be, which is just as ridiculous as Kurt Vonnegut's 12 Midorians. So there's a lot going on here. And the only explanation for why the manga has all these early notes somehow buried in it is the manga was originally serialized, and it ran from March of 1993 to September of 1994. So if the manga was started in the creative process years prior, it's possible that he got notes from 1992 and was okay, I'll make something out of what this is. And that's just sort of what happened.
Seems like that's likely the case.
Yeah. It's funny hearing about, not only is it a reference to Dale Cooper, but it's also a reference to the ads Kyle MacLachlan was starring in. That's so many layers of pop culture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if I wasn't like a hardcore Twin Peaks fan, I would have no idea. Like, it's very much like you had to be there. And if it was anything other than Twin Peaks that wasn't still so obsessively obsessed with decades later, then it would be 100% lost to time.
Mm-hmm.
I see again and again in these notes Itoi attempting to explore mundane realism in the world of Eagle Land. For example, early on, when you got your bike could get stolen, and you'd have to have a combination lock to like make sure that it wouldn't go anywhere.
It kind of gives us this glimpse into perhaps Itoi was somewhat responsive to the assessment the public had of Mother 1, because that's what comes across to me as why he would lean more into what could be seen as kind of pointless or even mildly infuriating realism, like getting your bike stolen and stuff like that. It comes across to me like perhaps he saw that was something people really enjoyed about the game and he decided to lean more into it.
It becomes downright visionary. You know what? I'll fast forward to that. This is a part of the exhibit that's weirdly kind of out of sequence. Eventually you get over to the corner. It's like kind of over, if you're watching the video of like the walkthrough, it's over near where the Mr. Saturn table display is. There is a bunch of notes from December of 1990 that I would say are the Spacebound era of ideas for the game. And there are things in there. It's like he's envisioning the side quests of Grand Theft Auto 4 and trying to make it happen on the Super Nintendo. There's a part-time job system where you could fish, fight cocks, draw pictures, be a door-to-door salesman, work at McDonald's, or get rid of moles in people's gardens. And to me, like, oh, we're talking about having little animals fight each other? Interesting idea for the first mother-like Pokemon, you know? Like, There's also character customization. It's not really elaborated on, but the sort of implication that maybe you would be able to customize your character. And this is tied to an idea that comes back from Mother 1 of a science teacher who allows you to waste your money on some kind of pointless character customization.
Yeah, it's interesting because like we've heard a lot about the development over the years of like there are a lot of things in early concepts and even like mid-development concepts for Mother 3 that sound more akin to like an Animal Crossing or something, which we have also heard from other sources. Animal Crossing ended up becoming kind of a more codified version of some of the ideas the toy had from this time, and perhaps they found their roots here.
Yeah, I think it's possible. There was a project codenamed Cabbage that Itoi worked on with Iwata and Miyamoto, and we've never mentioned it on the show before, but very likely it was an incubator for ideas that became Animal Crossing.
It also had like the most hilarious one-sentence pitch from Itoi, which is, it's a game where you can breathe with your friends. It's so crazy.
You said breathe, right?
No.
You said breed.
Breed.
You said breed. Okay, I was like, no, there's no way you said breed.
What? Wow.
What the heck?
What does that even mean?
It was planned to use like N64DD technology with all of like the possible combinations of code, like just to create like an infinitesimal amount of like original creatures. And it sounded like it was kind of like this Pokemon breeding type of experience. You know, we never got like a firm vision of what that would have looked like, but apparently that was a heavy or a large element of it.
Wow. Okay.
Someone interview more people about that experience.
Going back to the concept of jobs in the game for a second, I know that jobs are a concept that plays a big part in the Final Fantasy series. The first time that you could really sort of change your job and, you know, have an impact on your abilities and stuff was in Final Fantasy 3, which came out in 1990. I wonder if Itoi and the other creators at Ape were sort of looking at other games that were out at the time and sort of thinking, how can we take that concept and put it into our modern day JRPG about kids?
And that's a really good point, Jess. It is kind of like, just like the first game was the modern spin on Dragon Quest, having people have awkward part-time jobs is kind of like the mother version of Final Fantasy 3.
Yeah, it's a really fun concept of thinking of like, what is the party role of somebody who has a fast food job versus like, I don't know, cockfighting, apparently. It's a really fun thing to explore. Just what is the modern equivalent of that? How do you form a party based on your friends with all their part-time jobs?
We're killing the third strongest mole in the neighbor's yard.
Yeah, and it gets back to that idea of parodying mechanics from RPGs contemporarily like that. It makes a lot of artistic sense to further the identity and in the next installment of the series in that way, since the first one is mimicking obviously Dragon Quest and is mimicking that sort of thing with modern twists and humor. It makes sense that the next step for the series would be to continue to parody the other contemporaries.
Yeah. In these 1990 notes, there's some things like an overall sort of technical assessment, trying to figure out what's possible with the new hardware. So at the most, 4 player characters and or 2 NPCs, which is Flying Man or King, as in adjacent player characters that can step in. There's an illustration like a bubble of stars sitting on a flat grid, almost like a checked picnic blanket. And next to it, it says a Dune-style space map. And then I rewatched David Lynch's Dune recently, expecting to see maybe there was some kind of space map like that. None of the space maps looked anything like this illustration or any of the other doodles of space maps. The thing that looks most like any of these doodles and anything that happened in Dune is the map system in Star Fox. But maybe that's unrelated. I don't know.
They were all on a very much a Lynch kick.
Yeah, right? But that's Itoi for you.
Right.
He does have a painting by David Lynch somewhere in the office.
Really?
I have seen it. Yeah.
There was originally going to be 2 dungeon builders, a master and a disciple named Dunn and John.
Oh.
And there was an event where you could hijack the alien's UFO and the space police would catch you for speeding. And there's also a space taxi that would refuse service to you. And then weirdly on these 1990s notes, there's an extremely loose sketch of what looks like someone running away from or being spat out the back end of a caterpillar or silkworm with a body made of conjoined circles with arms and wearing a crown. And I looked at that and I was like, what the heck is that? It was if I felt like that scene in The Big Lebowski where the dude's looking at that little sketch that Jackie Treehorn made and being like, what's going on? What is that? And then when I was preparing my notes and trying to get all the enemy names together, I saw it. It's the criminal caterpillar and master criminal worm that appear in the 2 desert settings. It's this weird, very loose sketch of the same basic shape of this kind of 2-armed crown circle-bodied worm. And for some reason, this obscure enemy is on these pages from 1990 in this weird way.
Huh.
Itoi had a dream about a worm, and he's like, all right, quick, got to sketch it down. We're going to put it in the game somewhere.
It's like Gordon Cole's sketch of a deer in Twin Peaks: The Return.
It's interesting to think of it as, it sounds like it was intended to be a little alien thing, which, if you think about its role in the game, it does seem like a stray alien that just kind of ended up stranded in the desert. Because why otherwise would this little caterpillar be able to blast you with psi powers? Why is it worth so much experience to defeat these things? Yeah.
It's definitely meant to be jarring somewhat because they're so rare in each of those respective settings that it's supposed to catch your eye when it's there.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's just part of another one of those little jokes, one of those little weird jokes tucked away all throughout the game, and this one just didn't have the punchline written in exactly.
Right.
Right.
So the exhibit then, from that moment where it kind of turns the corner and you go in, the next thing that people encounter is the enemy art, all designed by Koichi Uyama. According to the placards at the exhibit, the first thing he did was he made the sprite art and everything else came after that. So the sprite art was kind of like the sketch phase, really. Eve appears on here in these sketches, as does the Flying Man and other characters who you know but you never fight. And it's possible they appear in this section because they're there as a kind of attempt to find the visual style by adapting things that had come before. But we don't know that for sure.
The one that sticks out to me in particular is that they have this one unused enemy who looks remarkably like Jack Frost from the Shin Megami Tensei series. And, could be just because jester hat, but the colorization of the face as well as the particular way the face is drawn just immediately sticks out to me.
There's a page of some notes, random notes about things that were given to Uyama to develop enemies from, lists of things to appear in regions. Like for Mr. Stupid Valley, cockroaches, frogs, leeches, snakes, worms, spiders, lizards. Generally, like a list of, I never made this correlation before that the Saturn Valley enemies are all pests, but the idea is it's pests that cause trouble for the Mr. Stupids. So in these lists of things, there's also some notes. A note from Itoi that says, aquatic life forms seen walking on land is probably going to make people uncomfortable, so try putting those enemies in weird places, like the underground, deep darkness, which might reflect like the manly fish or the zap eel. But fish with legs, desert starfish, land clam, land squid, these are all listed. Maybe land squids or mooks. But to me, this idea of like, hey, it's going to make people uncomfortable, that reflects the kind of discomfort that's caused by the chimeras in Mother 3 and seems to be something that is a reoccurring pattern, something that Itoi's sort of thinking about before eventually he figured out how to implement it as a plot component of Mother 3. In the early notes, it says the enemy characters change drastically due to some trigger. And also, there's an enemy sprite of like a flower with a dog face inside the stamen. And that feels very familiar. It has a lot of aesthetic similarities to the Pigtunia, but the face of the dog is like the dogfish, which then circles back to the idea of like aquatic life forms seen walking on land. Maybe these things are unrelated, but it's kind of weird that aesthetic pieces of them are starting to coalesce here.
Yeah, there's definitely a few Mother 3 isms that were in those early notes that ended up being not scrapped, but seemed to just reside in Itoi's subconscious for another few years before he ended up turning them into Mother 3 ideas.
Especially with Itoi saying so early on, before Mother 2 had even really gotten started, that he already had ideas for a potential third game of like what that could have eventually evolved into had Mother 2 stuck more to the original script.
Yeah, I mean, there was in these early pages, there was a question written of, can I continue with Mother 3? I don't know. But I think him reading Agatha Christoph's The Notebook during the production of Mother 2 kind of reverse engineered a lot of things, and all of a sudden he was pushing on with another idea when he eventually got to Mother 3.
Perhaps a lot of these unused enemy designs ended up being scrapped from the final game because it comes from a time in development where he was becoming more assured that a third game was something he was interested in pursuing.
Yeah.
One thing that was very interesting to me in those unused sprites were those non-enemy battle sprites, and having the context of them probably being used more for getting a feel for the game makes sense. Although I did enjoy, I think Biozilla brought up the idea that maybe there were plans for more like non-battle uses for the battle screen early on, similar to like the Moo training encounter. And like, I don't know if that was ever the plan, but I do really like that idea. It's something I've explored myself in games that I've made. And you can see similar ideas in other Mother-likes like Undertale, where something like the battle UI is used for date sequences instead.
Yeah.
And it's also just, I think, funny to think of the Moo training sequence, which is the only thing that still uses the battle screen in that way, as sort of a remnant of when EarthBound had Otome game sequences in it.
Yeah. There's a lot of cool things. You yourself out there listening can see the walkthrough video, and you can see a lot of this stuff now. Different variations on Starmen, a spider variant of the Skelpion, a red beret military person. There's all these different sprites of like military people and like potentially like military attack dogs or something. An anthropomorphic lobster with a ray gun, a demonic potato holding a looking glass. It's wild stuff. And it might just be like when making Star Wars films, like say Return of the Jedi. You can see this in the documentaries from Star Wars to Jedi. The creature shop designers would make all these different maquettes, all these different little alien designs. They'd line them all up and they'd say, hey, George, what do you want us to further develop?
And we would be remiss not to mention Return of the Jedi was almost directed by David Lynch.
That's true. Well, almost as my understanding is that he went out to have a talk about it, and he was basically like, no, I don't want to do this.
It's the best video ever hearing him describe the experience. He was like, my headache keeps getting worse. I mean, yeah, a lot of these unused enemies, you know, that are weird hogposhes of like seemingly a bunch of different ideas that feel like they're meant to be some sort of visual joke we don't have all the context for, perhaps. They certainly come across like that joke in South Park where jokes are being written by manatees putting a bunch of balls into a machine in a random order.
Yeah. Yes. Totally. And these crazy ideas are then like further reconfigured a whole bunch. For example, there is a series of what looks like worms coming out of the grass, but they've got heads like French fry boxes, like red heads with eyes and yellow stalks coming out of them. And then that same design kind of reappears later in the exhibit in part of like a sprite test where there's what looks like a proto version of the Ranboob, which is one of the enemies from Milky Well in EarthBound. And I double checked, and yeah, that's the enemy's name across both versions of the game. I don't know what was going on there. But instead of his like cactus-looking little head, he has a head of these French fry monsters, except that in this version, they're all green instead of red with, little French fries coming out of their boxes.
Yeah, you got your part-time job at McDonald's, and while you're working, the French fries come to life, and you have to beat them down.
Classic sci-fi trope, of course.
Just breed the French fries with a Hydra, and then you have infinite French fries eventually. You just cut off one head, 2 more sprout up. That's how McDonald's can get away with offering $1 fries at any size.
Over next to that same like alternate Ranboob concept, there's a bunch of just like sprite tests that are in a very different color palette from the rest of the game. They're very sort of desaturated. It looks like a half step between the NES and the Super NES, or maybe it was even running on NES hardware to make these graphics, like Ness with a chain of other characters following him that I think are just very random, not meant to be like any kind of early story ideas.
That is what I heard from my source, that they were created as very early concept art. Everyone keeps pointing out that the fourth party member who's in like the black helmet resembles like a samurai or something, but to me it looks exactly like Darth Vader. Does anyone else see that?
Oh yeah, no,
That's
it's
what I thought too when I saw that.
It's very Darth Vader looking. The only other thing that could possibly be, I think, is like maybe like not a samurai so much as like a ninja with like the little like metal headband thing. But the sprite reappears elsewhere in the exhibit. I think there's like a battle sprite for something that looks kind of like that, but a ninja, if I'm not mistaken. Well, we'll find out when we get the book, right? There's a section of hand-drawn illustrations of status effects, like where you get a mushroom on your head when you're walking around, there's a little ghost following you. Most of them are in the game, but there were some that didn't make it to the game. For example, smoke coming out of chimneys, steam coming out of coffee cups, music notes coming out of a jukebox, and honk honk coming out of a car. Little things like that. And there's lots of little things like that sprinkled throughout the exhibit.
I wonder why they didn't include them.
Probably just a hassle. Too much going on the screen, more things cause slowdown, unnecessary.
Yeah, there's already enough slowdown at many points in the game as is.
Yeah. There are these beautiful flowcharts, beautiful and or hot mess flowcharts in the exhibit that are pretty neat. Upon scrutinizing all of them, because they're extremely detailed, and you can watch as the penmanship sort of deteriorates as someone tries to outline the entire game and over the session of like a single meeting. Maybe there's something in there that's different, but by the time that these flowcharts were made, it appears that the core outline of the game is actually intact. There doesn't appear to be anything new in there. One of my favorite parts of the exhibit was seeing these hand-drawn overworld maps. I'm not sure who drew them, and they felt so familiar to me because in like 1996, I started drawing out, writing, scripting, whatever, a mother like when I was like 12 years old because EarthBound just seemed so like approachable. Like, oh, I could make a game too. This seems something I could do. And so my maps that I drew for the game that I was doing based on EarthBound look very similar to the maps that were being made in-house to develop EarthBound. Like, not only does that say, like, yeah, this kind of DIY aspect of the game is kind of like part of its DNA and very easily inspires others to do the same thing. But also, the most remarkable part was the hand-drawn quality of these maps. There's a charm that translates directly to the visual style of the overworld maps. Like, I would never call the overworld maps hand-drawn in quality, but actually something from these hand-drawn illustrations does actually translate one-to-one in terms of like the overall overworld visual aesthetic of the game.
Oh, 100%. And again, talking about things that are in the game's DNA, it tells you like without Itoi, who if he didn't draw these, at least helped kind of direct the direction they went in. Without him, there is no mother. And especially with like how like one-to-one it captures the pseudo like isometric view of the entire world, it feels like you could drop Ness's right into it, and this wouldn't be out of place in the entire world.
100%.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I thought when I was looking at it. And it was making me think about the sprite work in Mother 2 and how it almost looks like a child's drawing of the world.
Yeah, I agree.
It started making me think, like, how does, that sort of relate to the storytelling and taking the perspective of a child in the game, the way the child sees the world.
I agree, because like the way the Kraken is visualized is just the funniest thing, because it's not a Kraken whatsoever. It has this ginormous lollipop head that there's no way that would ever make any sense biologically. And once again, I reiterate, it's not a Kraken. It's like what a little kid imagines a Kraken might be just from hearing it's a sea monster.
Yeah, there's so many like doofy looking enemies in EarthBound. It's ridiculous.
One of the things I liked seeing was the prominence of Master Belch. Like, he was in those early sprites. He had several different iterations over the course of it.
Yeah, we got Belch with arms.
Yeah, the one with the arms are the ones with the with budding little piles that, I don't know, would they pop off of him? Is this how he breeds? I don't know.
He's gestating slimy little piles, maybe?
Yeah. I didn't, obviously I couldn't read this myself, but the person I was with, based on what they were saying, I got the impression that there was more backstory to Master Belch that just never really gets like explored, that I thought was fascinating. It sounded like he was an unusually effective soldier for the cause, kind of driven to please his superiors, but nobody liked him because he was gross. So he wasn't given very many opportunities for advancement. Like he deserved more, but like, yeah, just nobody liked him. He was kind of like a Dwight Schrute character.
Wow.
And
that's so real.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it's very funny for me just generally to imagine Geek's army, as being a bunch of petty middle managers all looking for advancement.
Now, I want to see like an Adult Swim type show using all the original clay models, or like, Robot Chicken, where they have these different scenes of Master Belch being upset because he's up for promotion, didn't get it.
Yeah, it's time for our EarthBound workplace drama. Where is it?
I'm glad that Itoi seems to have such an affinity for Master Belch. You can see there's so many designs for him. They made a plushie for him. He even has his own special sound effects for his battles. So it's nice to see Itoi has such an affinity for a character you can tell he liked a lot, even though it ended up having to be a character that had to have its role in the final game reduced.
But they still brought him back. They brought him back for one last ride there near the end. So it's like, no, he is important. We're going to make him important for a moment.
He's going to go down fighting no matter what.
And go down in a very spectacular way.
We can actually further corroborate this background about Master Belch and the drama of his rank in Geek's army. Similar character notes were given to localizer Marcus Lindblom when he was tasked to translate Mother 2 into EarthBound. His original source code scripting files, that is, the notes given to him by Ape to help provide context for creating the English translation, were uploaded by Lindblom to the Internet Archive in 2021. It essentially says, "He's big, strong, and filthy. He's the toughest monster among Geek's subordinates. Geek himself seems to be disgusted with him, and as such, he's been denied promotion." I'd say notes given for the translator to keep in mind while translating are as canon as anything in the game.
Another section that's in the exhibit was a sequence of hand-drawn intro sequence storyboards, which also, I was like, oh yeah, I did this too. I still have pages of me drawing my own title sequence to naming the characters section of a game that's drawn practically the same way as what's here in this exhibit. In an early version of Mother 2, you first see a meteor orbiting the Earth and slamming into it. And it says, presented by Shigesato Itoi, the Earth then moves to reposition itself to become the Mother logo. And the 2 below it appears, but it's straining. The logo itself is straining. It's going like, as it reads on like the piece of paper, it becomes tired and sad. It starts sweating and trembling, but it pulls itself together and becomes the full logo. Except then it starts sweating and trembling again and it loses its number. It then cuts to Ness in an amorphous room with a door in front of him against a background represented by some squiggles, which I think is meant to be the trippy battle backgrounds. And it's like kind of like a, hey, you should move your character sort of tutorial sequence. Like, start here, walk through the door. Okay, great. And then when you go through the door, you sleep in his bed and it starts the intro sequence of the game. So that's kind of where the differences stop. There are some sketches by Uyama that were also very interesting. They're very random. Some of them have sort of appeared before in different ways. There's a sketch of Dalam like suspended on the gushing water coming from a stone elephant. Like the town is suspended on this thing. And that's a piece of art that in its more finished version has been seen in like the Mother 1+2 art book. But there's also a very loose sketch of the main terminal of New York City's Grand Central Station, with the central focus being the iconic clock-topped information kiosk. It's an extremely loose sketch. It took me a while to figure out what I was even looking at. And then near that are also like sketches of really innocuous things like a ticket box office that would be like a theater or an amusement park. And then a thing that's sort of like the worthless protoplasm, but it descends into like a still image of a drop of water hitting a pool of water, and then an illustration of two ears connected by a looping tube like a memorial ribbon, but upside down. And best I could guess, I'm guessing this just like Uyama had some sketches. The sketches were in the box, and it was like, here, these were from this time. But
it's interesting to me, the town on top of the spurting water from the elephant is coming around again, because I remember that was like a big topic of discussion for people who like really explored the concept art back in like the latter days of Starman.net's like peak. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting to so many people, and it continues to intrigue me to this day, because like it seemed like Itoi had a fascination with like many towns and cities being in very illustriously high locations. Because you see that in Dalam, how it's on the mountain, and even like earlier iterations of it where it seems to have been like either on clouds or in snow or something like that. You see that with this elephant drawing, and then you also see that in the concept art, some earlier concept art of Dungeon Man, where it seems the top of his head was some sort of city as well.
Yeah. Gosh, that'd be fun to explore that.
It's kind of like, when you're going on an adventure and you're going someplace that most people don't go, you're going to go up or you're going to go down, and you got to travel a ways to get there. So it might just be as simple as that, too, that it's just removed from the normal experience that most people have every day.
Right.
It was really cool to see so many of the paper clay figures. Obviously, we spent a whole prior episode of Dimensional Slip talking about the inspiration that those have had for so many different artists throughout the history of the Mother fandom.
I was not at all expecting the actual original paper clay figures to be there at all. I was under the impression that they were lost somewhere. I didn't know that they were preserved so well, but I don't know why at the same time that was so surprising to me and others with how much Itoi does love this series.
They're still in remarkably good condition.
With very minute details on them, too.
It is crazy how detailed they are. Really something to behold, something like the Violent Roach. And I'm like, as an artist, like, oh my God. Even knew I would be afraid of this thing falling apart. It's so precise. The limbs are so narrow. The points on it are so fine. I'm just shocked that this thing is still keeping itself together after all this time. They're beautiful.
Yeah, I'm like, what kind of box or something were those being stored in? Because they look brand new.
30 years, and it still looks like that's something that could have happened very recently. I hope that before they pack everything away, they just take some really high quality photos of each one on like just a white background or something. Because it's just so jarring to think that this Ness I'm seeing in all these photos across social media is the same one that I saw in the player's guide when I was a little kid.
Yeah.
I'm hoping they're going to be included in the book that gets published.
Yeah, give me some new high definition renders
like
for people to use in thumbnails, please.
Yeah, and turnarounds. Because
yeah.
I could pivot my head and see the backs of them, but they didn't have a mirror up. I would love there to have been a mirror up so you could, so 3-dimensional figures, and there's a side of them we've never seen before.
The side of Mother you've never seen.
Yeah, the butt. So as the exhibit is wrapping itself up, there's a wall of 48 pieces of paper. The second programming director, Koji Malta, said that they couldn't release the game in the state that it was in May 5th, 1994. And keep in mind, Mother 2 released August 27th, 1994, so just a few months beforehand. Changes needed to be made to string together the different events to make the game more playable, so the staff as a whole checked the game and made a huge list of changes, many of them small quality of life tweaks, but some of them things that are absolutely shocking that were added so late. And I know this is a particular point of interest of yours, Charlie, and this is the part of the exhibit that I was able to go over the least. So I'm curious what you recall from this part of the exhibit and the things that were on this extremely late game series of changes and additions.
I definitely was fascinated by that section, especially because it should have been more together by that point. Like certain things like apparently the Runaway Five hadn't been established as being bad with money at that point. So the reason why you're helping them out is not clear. I think generally things were just not clear about how things were connected at that point. And so a lot of the notes are about actually providing some narrative clarity, which I think actually makes a certain amount of sense that things felt pretty disjointed at that point in the development, in part because game development is always very messy and things don't really come together until the last few months of a project anyway. But also, EarthBound, I feel far more than Mother 1 does feel like it has a clear narrative at the end that pulls you from one place to another.
Yeah.
Part of that is because it's just designed more linearly, but it still feels more interconnected than Mother 1. Mother 1 feels like it's a bunch of locations that you just kind of get unleashed upon early on in the game. And I think anybody who plays EarthBound really feels that interconnectedness a lot more whenever it goes away. Like whenever you reach Summers and you acquire Pooh and suddenly the game feels open in a way that it didn't before.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people who kind of stalled out at that point.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Like it's like suddenly you have so many options, so many threads to potentially pull, and you're not sure what's important. You're not sure where to go necessarily from there. And I wonder if part of that is that like they just didn't get to establishing that interconnectedness at that point. Like they ran out of time to really keep that clear narrative. Although, like, I think the game also reestablishes a clear, like, progression a little bit after that. Like, once you are on the boat from Toto going down to Scaraba, suddenly it's linear again. But yeah, I wonder if the game had felt like that a lot more earlier on because they hadn't made those final changes that they did.
Well, and like the development of the game was so disjointed through the entire process. And I mean, Satoru Iwata had to come in 1993 to help them get things back on track. And I'm sure that his part of coming in was sort of like correcting the course of the ship to help them figure out where they really ultimately wanted to be.
There's something to be said that this late in development, they were still trying to tie, a group as major as the Runaway Five to why they're even involved. Kind of shows like Itoi's mental state by the end of this, right? Because he very purposely took the game and story direction in the sequel in a very different direction from Mother 1 and 2's structures because he was tired of doing what he considered like the road trip movie thing. I wonder if that was a driving force in that just because of how many loose ends there are to tie up.
Oh, that makes sense. I mean, Mother, the first one, it is such an open world after a point.
Even at the very beginning, like you leave the house and it feels a lot more open than it really is. Like there is like a limitation of how far you can go, but you can also explore a lot before you even like get to Podunk proper if you took a wrong turn.
Yeah, I think it's a fair guess that Itoi, may have realized like, oh yeah, okay. Well, it was barely manageable the first time. It was even less manageable the second time. And it was a good instinct and cool things happened, but it would be really great to focus on storytelling and not this kind of huge explorable world concept, because if you keep making that bigger, it's going to come back to bite you. So maybe you should bottle that up a bit.
Mm-hmm. And then that way he was able to reel it in and really focus on each individual character, which seems like a lot of his passion has always lied in.
Yeah. One of, I think, the most surprising things that I saw on this list of final changes is the opening of the Magicant sequence wasn't there. So when you collect all the 8 melodies, they didn't automatically play. They made a change so that they would automatically play once you got all of them. And then from what I gather from these notes, the entire black and white flashback to Ness as a baby with his parents talking about his red hat may have been added at this last minute because the transition to Magicant was otherwise too abrupt to make any kind of sense, which is wild, if true.
Especially in a game that is so unapologetic about pulling you in a very weird, jarring direction so often.
If so, a very graceful solution to like just be like, okay, so we can add a little bit of a dream sequence here, and then you can just hard cut to Magicant like we were going to do anyway, and people are like, oh yeah, cool, that's a dream, that's fine.
Yeah, a lot of I think the notes there was just about making the game a little less jarring than it otherwise would have been.
And good grief, they must have not slept very much those few months.
Yeah.
No way.
As is tradition.
Yeah. So After that section in the exhibit, there's handwritten dialogue from Shigesato Itoi. Very early on, there were these dialogue forms made up so he'd know exactly the correct number of characters in each of the text windows, but then he later switched to dictating everything, which has been something that's been talked about quite a bit over the years. He dictated everything character by character, including punctuation, and that continued on into the development of Mother 3. But it was really cool to see these like early forms for fitting things into text boxes, and it was a pretty efficient and smart way to do it, but I guess it just didn't feel right in the end. There were also the handwritten lyrics to Smiles and Tears, a little background on the history of the Katsuman name drop in Mother 2, a restaurant that now no longer exists. Unfortunately, it died during the pandemic. And then, much to our surprise, a collection of Mother 2/EarthBound memorabilia, much of it, maybe all of it, belonging to Koala, the #1 collector of Mother's trilogy memorabilia in the whole world, which is a forthcoming dimensional slip where we'll talk to him and Muraishi, the #2 biggest collector in the world.
Yeah, that was weird, turning the corner and seeing those things there, and I was like, wait a second. We've seen this before.
I know this. This was in my hotel room a couple months ago, and now it's here. That's crazy.
It was something that was really nice, a nice gesture to see in the exhibit with how forthcoming, like recently, Itoi has been about caring so much about the overseas fans. It was such a nice gesture to see that they had the poster for the North American release there.
Yeah.
Seeing the word EarthBound in that exhibit was incredibly surprising. And again, just like a really nice gesture.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure.
It sort of tied the whole thing together, almost as if saying like, and there is another chapter to the story, but that's a story for another time. MonkeyNess, Charlie, thank you both so much for being here and exploring the Secrets of Mother 2 exhibit with us. What's next for you? Where can folks find you out there in the wilds of the internet?
All of my stuff is with Fangamer, so anything that Fangamer is doing, I'm probably connected to in some way, even if minor. But we're mostly just a merchandise store, so go to fangamer.com and buy a little bit of everything. We don't have as much EarthBound related stuff as we used to, but we do have a few things left over in case you wanted to, round out your Ness cosplay.
Still got those player's guides, right?
We do still have the player's guides, yes. We got guides for EarthBound and Mother 3.
Yeah, hard to find a player's guide in the English language relating to those games. So, and they're beautiful. They are absolutely gorgeous.
They're very good.
If all of our talk about them in the prior episode didn't convince you already, head on over to Fangamer. We'll link to them on this episode's page. How about you, MonkeyNess?
If you'd like to check out more of what I do, I make videos discussing the development history and as well as doing video essays on the artistic side of the Mother series on my YouTube channel. And I'm also on Twitter under the same name.
Thank you so much to Charlie and MonkeyNess for joining us. And thank you for listening. We'll be back as soon as humanly possible with our continuation of the story of EarthBound Beginnings.
Expect our interviews with Shigesato Itoi and Keiichi Suzuki in the new year.
To help us with that extensive post-production process, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/omniversemedia and stay up to date with Kat's production blogs.
Or drop us a line on our Discord at omniverse.media/Discord to see what's up and get in on our community of in-depth Mother discourse.
But for now,
that's all she wrote. Mother She Wrote is made possible thanks to the generous support of our producers, Amber Devereaux, Austin Brown, Becky Scott Fairley, Bob Hogan, CB, Danielle McDonald, Joe Tankrasiardelli, Josh King, Max Hansen, Mjolnir MK86, Patrick Webster, Sean Hutchinson, Sean T. Red, and our super deluxe executive producers, Big Bad Shadow Man, Marcus Larson, and Jamieson Lalone.
You can join the team on Patreon or supporting Cast. Just head to mothershewrote.earth/support. And if you think Mother She Wrote is simply smashing, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And be sure to subscribe via your favorite podcast player.
This series is recorded and produced in Orlando, Florida, and Louisville, Kentucky, on lands stolen from their indigenous people, the Timucua and Seminole, and Shawnee, Cherokee, Osage, Seneca Iroquois, Miami, Hopewell, and Adena.
Acknowledgement of the first peoples of these lands and the lasting repercussions of colonization is just the beginning of the restorative work that is necessary. Through awareness, we can prompt allyship, action, and ultimately decolonization.
For links to aid Indigenous efforts and to learn more about the First Nations of the land where you live, Visit omniverse.media/landback.
Mother She Wrote is written, produced, and performed by me, Jessica Mudd.
And me, Kat Blackard. Our original score is composed and performed by Jessica Mudd.
Mother She Wrote is not affiliated with Nintendo, Shigesato Itoi, or any rights holders of the Mother and EarthBound intellectual properties. Please play the game's official Nintendo releases.